A man took power with a rifle. 3 years later, he's producing medicine for an entire continent. That's not a metaphor. That's Burkina Faso. And that was the moment my brain short-circuited. I'm American. I was raised to believe that power earned through force is always wrong, that democracy saves lives and coups destroy them, that good guys wear suits, not fatigues. So when I heard about Ibrahim Traoré back in 2022, a 3-4-year-old military officer who overthrew his country's president, I did what most of us do. I judged, scrolled, forgot. It was just another headline from another country I couldn't find on a map, but then last week, that name popped up again. Burkina Faso just signed a $50 billion deal with Canada. Not for gold. Not for oil. For pharmaceuticals. They're building Africa's first large-scale, locally run, fully integrated drug manufacturing hub. And I froze. Because the last time I checked, we were the ones exporting medicine. Now this little West African nation, the one I ignored, dismissed, reduced to a blip, is stepping into a role we can't even play well ourselves. This wasn't a story about Africa anymore. It became a story about me. About what I've been taught, what I've assumed, and maybe what I've been wrong about. So I started digging, and the deeper I went, the more uncomfortable it got. We like our villains obvious. Guns, flags, angry speeches and bad lighting. But what if the villain isn't who we think, and what if the good guy doesn't look like us? Back in 2022, while we were debating democracy in a tweet thread, Traoré was tearing up military contracts, kicking out foreign troops, and nationalizing mines. Yeah, actual gold mines. Taking them back. I missed all of it. Why? Because that part of the story didn't go viral. No one posts, young African leader cuts French military ties, reinvests in rural health care. Doesn't get clicks. But that's what happened. He diverted mining profits into clinics. He forced out imported drugs to make way for local manufacturing. He didn't say, down with the West. He said, we're done waiting. And maybe that's more revolutionary than a rifle. The world didn't take him seriously. Until Canada called. With a contract. $50 billion. Not aid, not loans, a deal. To build a pharma hub in the heart of Burkina Faso, solar-powered, African-run, continent-facing. Meanwhile in the US, we ration insulin. We debate student lunch programs. We file bankruptcy over hospital bills. You tell me who's developing now? That's when it hit me. Maybe this isn't just a twist in the story. Maybe it's a whole new story, and we're not the main character anymore. What if we've been so focused on how power is taken, we forgot to ask what's done with it? Because that's the part no one trained us to see. We've been raised on a diet of origin stories, how leaders rise, not how they serve, how they shake hands, not how many hands they actually lift. Traoré didn't rise through a ballot box. He didn't do interviews on CNN. He just started building hospitals, distribution centers, medical schools, not in the capital. In places that didn't even have roads 10 years ago. We're not used to that. We're used to power that talks big and does little. He's doing the opposite. No slogans, just asphalt, syringes, blueprints. And I get it, it's uncomfortable. Because if someone we labeled illegitimate ends up doing more for his people than the ones we elect every 4 years, what does that say about us? What does that say about everything we've exported? Democracy, sanctions, lectures on transparency. But maybe all they needed was land, silence, and the right kind of rage. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind that builds. So here's the wildest thought I've had all week. What if the future of global health doesn't come from Geneva? What if it comes from Ouagadougou? And what if that future doesn't ask for permission? What if it just arrives? You ever notice how we always assume we're the template? We think if a country wants progress, they need to follow our path. Elections, aid packages, structural reforms, maybe a TED Talk. Then maybe they get to join the table. But what if they're not interested in our table? What if they're building their own? Because that's what it looks like in Burkina Faso right now. They're not asking for recognition. They're not lobbying for validation from the UN or the World Bank. They're paving roads to clinics and turning gold into antibiotics. No red carpets, just concrete. And the most uncomfortable part? It's working. Traoré didn't just talk about sovereignty, he engineered it. By turning away from dependency, by making deals that don't require them to shrink first, by refusing to trade dignity for development. That's not rebellion. That's architecture. We talk about freedom like it's a Western invention. He treats it like a resource, something to extract, distribute, reinvest. And yeah, I hear the critics. But what about democracy? What about human rights? Fair. Ask the questions. Demand the answers. But also ask, what has democracy given the average Burkina Faso farmer in the last 20 years? A vote every 5 years? Or the same poverty, just better explained? And here's the kicker, he's not asking us to copy him. He's not asking for applause. He's just doing the work. And somehow that's more threatening than any speech ever could be, because it means we're not needed. And for a country like mine, that's a hard pill to swallow. I used to think the global South was always looking up toward us, looking for help, for models, for meaning, but lately it feels like they're not looking up anymore. They're looking across. Or worse for our ego, looking right past us. And why wouldn't they? When Traoré nationalized the mines, France pulled out. When he kicked out the IMF, we clutched our pearls. And when he announced Burkina Faso would produce its own medicines, we laughed. Until the deal with Canada landed. Until the lab construction began. Until they hired researchers from Senegal, Ghana, even the diaspora in Atlanta. They're not building for aid, they're building for scale. It's no longer about survival, it's about positioning. Not just how do we fix this, but how do we own it? And that scares people, because it means the margins aren't begging for a seat anymore, they're designing the blueprint. Here's a question I haven't stopped asking. What happens when Africa stops asking for inclusion and starts asking for return of resources, of dignity, of power? And what happens when they do it not with war but with Wi-Fi, vaccines, patents, and food sovereignty? That's not a revolt, that's a reversal. And maybe deep down we know it. That's why we're uneasy. That's why we joke. That's why we scroll fast. Because it's easier to laugh at a coup than to admit you're watching your worldview crack open. I've tried to file this story away. Believe me, I have. Strongman, authoritarian, populist. Whatever label helps me sleep, because the truth is harder to sit with. What if he's a contradiction we don't have language for? He didn't hold elections, but he fed 2 million kids. He controls the press, but he let farmers rewrite budget priorities. He bans Western troops but builds clinics with Western tech. Tell me, is he a dictator or a disruptor? A nationalist or a post-colonial realist? Honestly, I don't know anymore. And maybe that's the point. We want leaders to fit neatly, hero or villain, progressive or oppressive. But what if leadership, real, messy, nation-changing leadership, lives in the gray? What if the question isn't, is he democratic? But, is he delivering? And when the people chanting his name are the ones who used to sleep without dinner, maybe that's the only ballot that counts. I still flinch when I say that out loud, because I've grown up in a system that tells me process is everything. But in Burkina Faso, results are the process. And that messes with me, deeply, because if a man with no campaign, no donors, no official mandate, can build medicine factories while we argue about tax brackets, then maybe the contradiction isn't him, maybe it's us. I kept thinking this story was about Burkina Faso, but the more I dug, the more I realized it's not. It's about us. Because for every headline we wrote about instability, there was a photo we didn't post of kids lining up outside a new rural clinic, of women learning to manage supply chains, of villages lit by solar power where there used to be none. And while we debated whether Traoré was legitimate, he was debating which crops to subsidize first, rice or millet. That's not chaos, that's governance. And it puts us in an awkward spot, doesn't it? Because we've built our moral high ground on systems, ballots, courts, press freedom, but those systems haven't kept insulin under $100. They haven't stopped black mothers from dying in childbirth, in the richest country on earth. So what happens when a country with none of our systems starts solving problems we still haven't? What happens when the mirror turns? When it's no longer Africa we analyze but America? You can feel it, right? That weird discomfort, that heat in the chest, that weight, are we the ones behind? Feeling, it's real. Because the Burkina Faso story doesn't fit into our folders, it doesn't obey our timelines, it doesn't wait for our approval. And it sure as hell doesn't apologize for the discomfort it causes. Maybe it's not supposed to. I've talked to friends about this, journalists, NGO workers, even a guy from the State Department, and they all say the same thing, in slightly different words. He's dangerous. He's unpredictable. He doesn't follow the rules. And maybe they're right. But whose rules? The ones that say you need a degree from Harvard before you touch policy. The ones that tell you to wait for permission, funding, certification, recognition. He skipped all of that and started doing. And it's that part that makes people squirm, because it calls out how much of our leadership is performative. We talk, we plan, we workshop solutions. He just moved. You don't have to love the man, but you can't ignore the math. More clinics, more kids in school, more medicine in hands, less foreign dependence, less waiting, less asking nicely. And here's the irony. If he wore a suit and spoke English, we'd probably put him on a magazine cover. But he doesn't. He wears military boots, speaks in local dialects, quotes farmers more than economists. So instead of admiring him, we interrogate him, because he makes the whole system look fragile. Like maybe it's not corruption that's holding others back. Maybe it's obedience. And if that's true, we've got a bigger problem than Burkina Faso. We've got a mirror none of us want to stand in front of. What if he's not the outlier? What if Ibrahim Traoré is just the first one who got loud enough, fast enough, and stubborn enough to break through the static? What if there are others watching, learning, rewriting the rule book without telling us? Because let's be honest, the old rule book hasn't aged well. It says, get elected, shake hands, accept loans, play by the development script. Meanwhile, entire generations wait, and wait, and wait. But in Burkina Faso, something snapped. Not in rage, in clarity. They stopped asking, what's the acceptable way to change? And started asking, what actually changes things? That's a terrifying shift for us, because it moves the center of gravity. Suddenly, legitimacy isn't about how pretty your flag is or how well your English sounds at the UN. It's about who gets clean water fastest, who gets kids into classrooms, who breaks the cycle of begging for medicine they could make themselves. And if that's the new scorecard, then yeah, Traoré's not just winning, he's writing a new game entirely. The question is, what happens when others follow? What happens when the next leader doesn't wear a tie, doesn't care for protocol, and still delivers? Do we ignore them too? Or do we finally admit that maybe the shape of progress doesn't look like us anymore? We came into this thinking we were evaluating a man, a soldier, a rebel, a headline. But somewhere along the way, the story flipped. Because this isn't just about Ibrahim Traoré, it's about what he reveals, about how deeply we've tied morality to style, not substance. About how we've convinced ourselves that the process matters more than the people it's supposed to serve. He didn't wait for approval. He didn't audition for Western praise. He saw a broken system and he built something. Maybe it's messy, maybe it's flawed, but it's his. And it works better than what most stable governments have managed to do in decades. So ask yourself, what matters more, how power is gained or how it's used? Would you rather live under a man you didn't vote for, but who built schools, hospitals, and fed your kids, or under one you did vote for, who gave you speeches, gridlock, and excuses? That's not an easy question, but it's one we can't avoid anymore. And if this made you pause, if it challenged something you've always believed, then don't scroll past. Comment, share, debate. I want to hear your take. I want to be wrong. I want to learn, because I think the world's shifting. And the least we can do is shift with it eyes open.